Of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM, AM 1160. It's been a really busy morning here. Lots of folks stopping by to visit with us. And we're happy to have Senator Joe Pittman joining us this morning, too. Senator, good morning to you.
Todd, good morning.
Good to have you back with us. Our conversation brought to you by Marcus and Mack, a law firm representing injured people. And of course, when we're talking with you, and especially this week after last week's activities, we have to start with Reggie, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Very passionate speech by you, very good points raised by you on the floor of the Senate last week. Did not get the one more vote that you needed for the override vote of the governor's veto. And so at that point, we were looking at the governor being able to move forward, go ahead and advertise the ordinance and the regulation, and Pennsylvania would be tied in come July. Commonwealth Court then stepped in the next day and said, well, hold on just a moment. How strong is the Commonwealth Court's commitment to actually reviewing this case?
Well, my sense is it's a pretty strong commitment to reviewing the case, and it should be, because it's been our conversation about this since the beginning when that executive order was issued almost 3 years ago, that this is such a broad policy matter that it needs to come through the legislature. And what the Commonwealth Court essentially said was, hold on until we have an opportunity to dig into the merits of this issue. Now, the department has appealed this to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court has asked for an answer to the appeal in 14 days, and then they will make a decision on the appeal. But understand, the appeal is just on the pause to the regulation. We have not even begun to get to the merits of the issue. And so we'll see where it goes. But, you know, this has been some pretty accurate foreshadowing, in what many have said is that if you don't do this through the legislative process, it will end up tied up in court. And regardless of the outcome, it's likely to be a months-long ordeal, and it will likely go well past the governor's term in office in January.
So would you say that the court is more interested in the regulation itself or in the process by which the governor is doing this through executive action without the legislatures being able to have a voice in it?
Well, that's impossible to predict, but what we can say is the court recognizes that if this is published and the court makes a decision after the fact that for whatever reason the merits dictate it be thrown out, that there has been irreparable harm in the meantime. And that's been our argument, is that if we go into this Reggie pending all of these legal disputes and the courts determine we should not be, a lot of the die has already been cast. And actually that's been a big part of our argument about Reggie since the day of the executive order. The power plants have no certainty in terms of the environment within which they need to operate. And so their maintenance issues and things of that nature keep being deferred. They don't have, a long-term runway, and that's what made the Homer City power plant decisions over the last few months particularly telling and interesting.
Well, that being the case, last week we were surprised by the announcement by the Homer City Generating Station that they're going to give it a go. Were you surprised by that? Was there something going on behind the scenes that we weren't aware of?
Well, I think, and I certainly can't speak for the ownership of the Homer City power plant, but in order to bid into the power grid, the PJM, the grid that we are part of, requires all generation entities to give them advance notice as to whether or not they plan to try to bid into the next cycle for production of power, because ultimately the grid needs to make sure there's enough potential power coming into the market, because they can actually say, no, you have to bid. You have to continue to bid and operate if we don't have enough overall capacity. So they had to send that notice in, and they had 60 days of review opportunity. And if you think about what's happened in those 60 days, probably the most significant issue is what has happened in the Ukraine. And if you look at the domino effect of what's occurring in the energy world right now, it is spiking the price of all sources of power. It's spiking the cost of natural gas. It's spiking the cost of coal. It's even spiking the cost of renewables, because the minerals that we get from overseas are now being further strained. Russia produces a lot of those materials and those minerals. I just saw a headline before I walked in this morning that our natural gas reserves are being depleted because we're already figuring out how to export it to other countries to make up for what Russia had historically been producing. So I think the power market dynamic has changed so drastically in the next 60 days, or the last 60 days, excuse me, that had to have played in as part of the decision.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to watch that whole system unfold. I'm sure that you're not done with whatever it is that you can do to help to push your argument along. I got a call last week from somebody wanting to come on to talk about the other side of the argument, and we'll have those folks on with us, and we'll discuss it even further. But the Reggie situation, I've always contended, I think you have as well, is not something that should be decided by one third of what is the state government. It should be the entire government involved.
Absolutely. It should be the entire government involved, and there should also be some recognition to the impact that decisions we make have relative to the states around us and nationally. I've long argued that if you really want to go down a carbon tax path, it should be a national approach. That way, the power production in Pennsylvania is on the same footing as the power production in Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, every other state in the nation. But to have us willfully put ourselves at an uncompetitive advantage compared to other states just simply makes no sense.
Senator Joe Pittman with us here this morning on Indiana in the Morning. I want to ask you a question. I asked a similar question of Representative Struzzi when he was here last week. That was about the PIAA and their executive director, Bob Lombardi, talking about the private school versus boundary schools, if you will, argument in terms of competitive balance. Mr. Lombardi's contention being that they'd be sued if they decided to go with just a private school championship and a public school championship, and they're aware of that, and so they're going to wait until the General Assembly one day forces them to. Otherwise, there will be no changes, and it will continue the way that it has been with that competitive imbalance. What's your reaction when you hear those sorts of points made?
Well, the PIAA, I believe, has had a long history of being very inattentive to the concerns of not only their member schools, but also to the parents and the public who are very interested in having a fair, competitive playing field for student athletes. And, there may be legal ramifications to any decisions that would be made to have separate classifications or separate championships. I mean, I look at the PIAA. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, I think there were 4 classes. I think there's now 6 or 7 classes. And so, they've shown that they adapt and evolve when they want to. I think there is a very inherent issue here. It's quite obvious when you look at the success of private schools in the championship games versus the public schools that there is a clear tilting of the balance. And I would be an advocate for figuring out how to rebalance that. Could there be lawsuits? I'm not an attorney. It would probably largely depend on what the legislation would look like, but aren't there always lawsuits? I do think this is something that we need to bring to a more serious level of review as part of the legislature.
The legislature does have oversight authority over the PIAA, but it typically has just said you're set up to operate the way that you operate. We're going to let you do that, and the legislature has been reluctant to step in, as Mr. Lombardi is suggesting it must if there are ever going to be a change.
Absolutely. I mean, we place commissions and boards, whether it's the Game Commission, Fish Commission, Gaming Control Board. These entities exist because we prefer to rely on their expertise and their understanding of how best to proceed. It's not in our interests or desires to meddle in everything, but there are times, obviously, where we have oversight and we need to engage in that oversight, and I think this is quickly rising to one of those situations.
Senator Joe Pittman with us this morning. Of course, the Reggie situation is something that has taken up a lot of your time and the attention of a lot of people in Harrisburg, but there are other things. Certainly the budget is one of those things. And as we move forward here into the coming weeks and months, and eventually we'll get to a budget resolution, what are some of the top priorities for you in Harrisburg?
Budget aside, one of the things that we'll be tackling later this week is election integrity, namely the regulation of what are called drop boxes. These have been something that were created by the courts in 2020. Are not in statute. They are not authorized. And it's caused a lot of concern over what we call the chain of custody of a ballot from the time the voter casts the ballot. If they do vote by mail, if they don't put it in a mailbox, they put them in these drop boxes. Well, the voter is supposed to put their ballot in the drop box, and there's supposed to be integrity in that process. And as time has gone on, it's clear that those drop boxes are not very well observed or regulated. And so we are very much eager to try to make this process a smooth process and a clear process, and one where we don't have drop boxes all over the place. Mm-hmm. Whether people like it or not, a significant part of our electorate does not have confidence in our electoral process. And when you don't have confidence in the electoral process, it's a great detriment to our constitutional republic. And we have to help work to restore the faith in the process. And I think regulating drop boxes would be a big part of that.
So that's coming up, that argument.
I expect that this week in the Senate.
One of the items that has come up in other states, and I don't know how much it's been discussed in Harrisburg, probably you have heard rumblings about it, is the issue of gender identity in sports and the competitiveness. Are girls' sports and women's sports being squeezed out by transgender athletes who identify as female and get to compete as women or as girls? It's part of a larger conversation having to do with gender identity. Where do you stand on that whole competitive issue?
We are looking to advance bills along those lines as well. I go back to the whole premise of Title IX and ensuring that there was athletic opportunity regardless of your gender. And here we are now having this type of situation where genetically defined males are competing in female athletics. And I think that's completely inappropriate. I don't think it's fair to anybody. I don't think it's fair to the gender identified athlete that is transitioned, and I don't think it's fair to the female athletes who have worked within the sphere of female athletics for their entire careers and have been able to grow and develop into collegiate athletics in particular, and see themselves in a situation where they simply can't fairly compete. I don't think that's wise. I don't think it's appropriate, and I do think it needs to be addressed.
All right. He's Senator Joe Pittman. Events coming up around the area?
The events coming up around the area, we will have a senior expo in the Murraysville area here early May. The greatest thing that I'm excited about is our student government seminar. Senator White used to have student government seminars, and ever since he retired, we have not been able to have one because of COVID. And so we will have our very first student government seminar, which I'm really looking forward to. And it brings, I believe we have every high school in the district participating or close to it. We'll bring students to IUP, and we have a day where they're able to work in legislative committees on issues of concern. We have people come in as panelists and help coach them along, and then they have the ability in the afternoon to debate the issue and actually cast a vote on a piece of legislation. So I'm really looking forward to that. It's April 29th, I believe, 28th, 29th. And I think it's going to be a great opportunity, and it's really, to me personally, a sign of finally getting back to real normal in terms of how we operate.
That would be a good thing.
Indeed.
Senator Pittman, thanks for coming in today.
Okay, Todd, thank you.
It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. 9:25 and the CBS Sports Minute next.